The story of Peter Pan by Scottish novelist and playwright J.M. Barrie has been delighting audiences for over 100 years. Since Barrie's first iterations of the tale at the turn of the century, Peter's story has been adapted, reinterpreted, and reimagined by every subsequent generation, from the 1953 Disney animated movie to Robin Williams' Hook, to the 2006 official sequel novel Peter Pan in Scarlet, to the latest movie released just in 2015, simply entitled Pan. Like Peter himself, our fascination with this character just refuses to age or die. Whatever our familiarity with the literary, theatrical, and cinematic iterations of the tale of Peter Pan, most of us know the basic story. All children except one grow up, and that one is named Peter Pan. He is, or at least was, a normal boy who early in life was separated from his mother. He made his way to Neverland, a magical fantasy island accessible to all children somewhere between waking and sleeping, yet also somehow able to maintain a real and physical existence far across the ocean. There, Peter communes with fairies who have granted him the ability to fly, and on one particular and fateful night, he flies to the real world and visits the Darling household, and he takes with him to Neverland the three Darling children, Wendy, John, and Michael. In Neverland, Peter is the leader of the Lost Boys, a group of children, all boys, who have also been separated from their parents. Their lives in Neverland are a perpetual series of magical adventures, often fraught with very real dangers. The island is full of savage beasts, natives, and pirates. In Neverland, Wendy assumes the role of mother to the Lost Boys. Together, they engage in countless adventures, culminating in a duel between Peter and his arch nemesis, the dread pirate Captain James Hook. Peter defeats the captain, sending him into the mouth of a crocodile. Following this climax, Peter returns the Darling children back to their waiting parents, who also adopt all the Lost Boys as well. And they all live happily ever after, except not really. You see, Peter refuses to be adopted, refuses to remain in the real world, for he knows doing so means he will have to grow up and become a man. So nothing ever becomes of a possible hinted at romantic relationship between him and Wendy. Wendy grows old, has children of her own, and she too eventually dies. But Peter lives on, young forever, forever unattached to anyone by the bonds of love. Because I've been tasked this morning to deliver a sermon on Peter Pan, here in the context of a worship service, I do not wish to simply offer up a general literary analysis of Peter Pan like you might hear in a college classroom. Instead, I want to examine Peter Pan through a decidedly religious lens. And so to do this, I went back and read Barrie's novel as if I were reading sacred text. And so from that exegesis this morning, I'm going to pull a few of my observations, which will have a decidedly and intentionally theological flavor. I would like to start by noting that the story of Peter Pan is not a simple one. It is not a simple glorifications of the virtues of childhood as many modern children's stories are. Its treatment of childhood and adulthood and the relationship between the two is nuanced and complex, quite worthy of theological reflection. To understand and interpret what this text tells us of both childhood and adulthood, I'm going to center this reflection around an examination of the four most important characters in this book. We will start, of course, with the titular protagonist, Peter Pan. The ageless boy is a deceptively complex character. He is a seamless amalgam of multiple literary and mythical archetypes. And from his name alone, we can detect that he is simultaneously a Christ figure and a devil figure wrapped in one. Pan, Peter's surname, is not a name chosen randomly from a phone book. Pan was the ancient Greek god of the wilderness. The god Pan, like the character Peter, is associated with all things wild and undomesticated, nature and nymphs or fairies. And both, of course, Pan and Peter play the flute. Over time, the Greek god Pan became a synecdoche, symbolizing for Christians the entirety of the pagan world. As such, Christianity literally turned Pan into the devil. Recall that Pan had the torso and head of a man, but the legs and horns of a goat. Christianity came to promote this very specific image with the devil himself. Now, just as the surname Pan was no accident, likewise, I would suggest the name Peter was not selected merely for alliterative effect. In the English language, no name comes closer to that of Jesus. English-speaking peoples have a taboo against naming their children after the Lord and Savior of Christianity. So the closest thing to Jesus we have in English is Peter, Jesus Christ's most important disciple, founder of the Church of Rome and Catholicism's first pope. But Peter Pan's connection to Christ goes far deeper than just the name. Think about it. Peter Pan is magical or miraculous. He lives forever. He has a group of all male disciples. He can make food appear out of his imagination, out of thin air. He ascends into the sky and flies. He raises Wendy from the dead. He sacrifices his own life for others, yet does not actually end up dead. He appears only to those who really believe in him. And of course, especially in the Disney animated film, he flies in a very peculiar manner with his feet together, hands extended, and chest out, as if he is being crucified on a cross. If you don't believe me, go to Google Images, type in Peter Pan, and see what the first image that comes up looks like. In the character of Peter Pan, we see the duality of Christ and the devil collapsed into a singularity. But Peter Pan is not the first example of a Christ-devil duality from history and mythology. There is a Latin term used by Ovid in the Metamorphoses, puer aeternus. Literally translated, this means eternal boy. In the study of mythology, this phrase is often used to reference eternally young child gods. And it so happens that these gods are often associated with vegetation and resurrection. Dionysus, Attis, Tammuz, Adonis. If you've ever read Fraser's anthropological masterpiece, The Golden Bough, you know that all these gods fit the dying, resurrecting king god motif that prefigured the story of Jesus Christ. So just add Peter Pan to the list. And then, of course, there is this very interesting story that comes to us from the ancient Roman historian Plutarch. About 2,000 years ago, says Plutarch, a sailor heard a voice from heaven declare, "The great Pan is dead." Now, later Christian theologians interpreted this declaration to be a miraculous sign from God, indicating that the reign of Pan, i.e., the devil, had ended because of Jesus Christ, whose resurrection had ushered in a new dispensational age of grace. However, there were some later Christian theologians who interpreted this statement a bit differently. They argued that the voice actually said, "The great god of Pan is dead." Pan is also the Greek word for all. And so the later Christian argument goes that the heavenly voice declared that the great God of all things had just died. And of course, from a Christian perspective, the great God of all is Jesus, who would have been crucified at nearly the exact date that Plutarch's story is reputed to have occurred. So the story of Peter Pan is not the first time that Christ and Pan have been so bound up together. Now, to add further complexity and confusion to the character of Peter, we can also see that he fits quite nicely into the archetype of the trickster god, like Hermes or Loki. Like Hermes, Peter sometimes acts as a psychopompos. That's a big fancy Greek word that simply means one who helps ferry the souls of the dead to the afterlife. The novel tells us that Peter occasionally escorted the souls of departed children halfway to the afterlife. And like other trickster gods, Peter is a master of mimicry. For example, Peter is able to perfectly impersonate the voice of Captain Hook, causing all kinds of mischief and confusion and chaos, which of course is the hallmark of the archetypal trickster. Moreover, like a good trickster, and especially a deeply ambivalent trickster representing both Christ and the devil, Peter was known to randomly flip sides in the middle of a battle. So, is Peter Pan the Christ-devil trickster? Is he good or is he bad? Is he a hero or is he a villain? Well, let's think about this. He's young, beautiful, powerful, magical, willing to sacrifice himself for others, cares deeply for children, and has a strong core central value of justice and fairness. He's also cocky, capricious, self-centered to the point of narcissistic, incapable of empathy, refuses responsibility, lives only to play and seek adventure, and he is a child soldier who kills and also goes and kidnaps other children and trains them to kill as well. So is Peter Pan a hero or a villain? Certainly he is depicted as a hero by Walt Disney. On the other hand, Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, among other novels, associated quote-unquote Peter Panism, or the Peter Pan syndrome, with Adolf Hitler. Hero or villain? We'll return to that question a bit later. Our second major character to analyze is Wendy Darling. She is a liminal being, an adolescent girl on the precipice of adulthood, straddling both worlds. She appears to fall in love with Peter, but her love goes unrequited. Now, if Peter Pan is a Christ devil figure, then Wendy is a figure of the Virgin Mary. She is a virginal, young teenage girl who magically becomes Peter's mother in Neverland. Not only does she play the part of virginal mother to Peter, the Christ, in her light blue gown, if you remember from the Disney movie, she also plays mother to all of the Lost Boys. Indeed, there is an unusual fixation with the idea of motherhood throughout the entire novel, especially amongst the inhabitants of Neverland. There, motherhood is a form of magic, a magic that is strange and powerful even in a land where magic is perfectly normal. Even the adult pirates speak reverently of the magic of motherhood. To the Lost Boys, Wendy is a virginal mother goddess. But in addition to representing the maternal divine, Wendy also represents another archetypal identity, the storyteller. The novel tells us the primary reason Peter kidnaps Wendy is so that he can hear her finish telling the story of Cinderella. Peter loves Wendy's stories, as do the Lost Boys. Wendy, as both divine mother and storyteller, gives birth to meaning by the sacred spinning of stories. Like the Hebrew God, with merely her words, she brings light to darkness, order to chaos. Her stories, drawing lines of connection between cause and effect, anchor, root, and ground the Lost Boys in both space and time. Her stories create for them a past and a future. Before Wendy comes with her stories, the children, including Peter, are very, very forgetful, unable to remember even simple details from the past. Like all children, they live in a constant, hyper-present now because they have no stories to connect them to their own pasts or give them a framework for understanding the future. And this grounding in space and time, this opportunity to create meaning, is exactly what Mother Church, through story and myth, has offered humanity for millennia. Our third character to study, Captain James Hook, a fascinating individual whom we unfortunately will not have enough time to sufficiently fully analyze this morning. He is Pan's primary antagonist, or at least purported antagonist. He at least looks the part. He is, after all, a scary, bloodthirsty pirate. But as the novel makes clear, he is actually of high birth. He is classically educated, somewhat handsome, courteous, obsessed with good form, all sorts of things that mean something to adults. If he truly is Pan's primary antagonist, then ironically, he's actually more of a relatable character to readers than Pan himself. Hook is so very, very human. He is filled with self-doubt. He struggles to embody his ideal self. He lives in constant fear. Not of Peter Pan. He doesn't fear Peter, he just hates him. And we'll talk about that hatred in a moment. Hook fears only one thing. And here's the part where we'll have some audience participation. Who can tell me what is the one thing that Hook fears? Duncan, I see your hand up. What's that? The crocodile. Excellent, right. Very, very close to a right answer. You'll recall in all the stories that Peter threw Captain Hook's hand to a crocodile, who thus acquired a taste for the captain's flesh, and as a result began pursuing him all across Neverland, hoping to finish his meal. And as Duncan reminds us, we recall that the crocodile happened to also swallow a clock, which, ever and anon, betrayed his presence to Hook, for Hook could hear its constant tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. But see, I don't think Hook was actually afraid of a crocodile with a clock in his belly. Rather, like every single one of us adults, he was afraid of a clock with teeth. It wasn't a crocodile that eternally, relentlessly, inexorably pursued Hook. It was time. Its constant ticking, a reminder to Hook that he was always pursued by and would eventually be devoured by time. You see, Hook represents adulthood, and with adulthood comes the self-awareness that we are mortal and finite beings. In the end, we will not escape the clutches of time. Captain Hook was never able to reconcile himself to this fate, and so he lived in constant fear, a type of fear that children, the truly young, simply do not understand. And I would argue that it was from this fear that Hook's hatred of Pan was born. Yes, Pan chopped off Hook's hand, but the novel is fairly clear that this was not the reason Hook hated Pan. Hook was not motivated by simple revenge. The book gives us a different answer, for it states unequivocally that Hook hated Pan because of Pan's cockiness. Pan's cockiness is of a specific species unique to youth. It's that youthful arrogance that doesn't understand how the world works. It ignores the past. It leads young people to an ignorance of how truly small they are in the grand cosmic scheme of things. It's a cockiness that exists because the young who possess it haven't yet been beaten down and trained to understand failure. Pan's youthful cockiness believes itself invincible, believes itself to be the center of the universe. It's the type of cockiness that can tragically lead the young dashed against the rocks. But it's also the kind of cockiness that births a boldness and a courage and an irrational confidence in the young, which allows them, against all odds sometimes, to fight giants and win. Like a child fighting and defeating a grown pirate. Hook bitterly hates Pan's cockiness and the youthfulness that it represents. As they engage in their final duel, Hook, near defeat in exasperation and desperation, calls out, "Pan, who and what art thou?" Peter replies, "I'm youth. I'm joy. I'm a little bird that has broken out of the egg." Pan defeats Hook because Pan will always defeat Hook. This world is for the young. And should the two ever come to blows, youth will always defeat age. Youth always triumphs. And here we can now begin to answer the great question about Peter Pan. Is he hero or villain? The answer, of course, is both and neither. Though he represents both God and devil and trickster, what he most purely represents is youth, unbridled and unadulterated, so to speak. Youth in all its complexity and paradox, in all its light and shadow. Now, this view of youth stands in stark contrast to the simplified, reduced, and romanticized view of childhood that much of modern children's literature has adopted. We, in this Western contemporary world, have created a bit of a cult of childhood. Modernity has promoted the idea that children are born perfect and innocent, that adults are merely large, corrupted children, and that all adults would do better to get back in touch with their inner child. Today, we live in an age that has glorified, if not deified, the perfect virtues of childhood. But the true and full nature of childhood and youth, the story of Peter Pan argues, is far more complex, far more ambiguous, far more full of shadows. At the end of the novel, Wendy grows up, and she has her own daughter, Jane. Jane asks her mother, "Why can't you fly now, Mother?" "Because I'm grown up," Wendy answers. "When people grow up, they forget the way." "Why do they forget the way?" asks Jane. "Well, because they are no longer gay and innocent and heartless. It is only the gay and innocent and heartless who can fly." Young children can fly only because they are heartless. Now, that's not something you will read in most children's books today, but it has a measure of truth. There is much psychological research that suggests children are not born with empathy. Now, they are born with the capacity to empathize, but empathy is primarily a learned and cultivated behavior. And so how do children learn it? From adults. Without empathy, there can be no deep, genuine relationships. Thus, no attachments to anyone, keeping you anchored, rooted, grounded to Mother Earth and all who inhabit it. In Peter Pan, children can fly, but only at the expense of having real connections and relationships bound by sinews of love. Children do not come out of the womb understanding love. They understand only dependency. They will learn love if we can teach it to them. Love, empathy, a heart, that is what stops children from flying. And ultimately, as the story of Peter Pan reveals to us, love is actually what makes children grow up. And that is why the eternally young Peter Pan's greatest nemesis is not Captain Hook. It is Wendy's mother, our fourth and final character to analyze. The kryptonite to Peter Pan's complete childlike self-absorption is the completely selfless, unconditional love of a mother. And this is exemplified in Mrs. Darling. She appears for only a few pages. Nevertheless, the narrator declares her his favorite character. Throughout the entire tale, Peter has been doing everything he can to keep Wendy with him in Neverland. And though Wendy stays with him for quite a while, she ultimately decides that she wants to return to her mother. Wendy's love and connection to her mother overpowers her desire to be with Peter. Peter can and always will defeat Hook, but he will always lose to Wendy's mother. Such is the power of a mother's love. And it's a lovely bit of misdirection. You see, at the beginning of the story, we've been led to believe that it was going to be Wendy's father who would make her grow up. His maturity, his practicality, his necktie, his understanding of stocks and shares. But in the end, it is actually her mother's unconditional love that grounds Wendy, roots her, so that she can no longer fly without care. It is her mother's love that plants the seed of a heart in her chest, which marks her entry into the adult world. Growing up is bittersweet, but such is the lot of humankind. But don't despair too much. No one grows up completely. Though we all eventually stop our visits to Neverland, I do think that if we try, we can still find a little piece of it within us. In fact, I think that's exactly what Mrs. Darling did. The good book tells us that Mrs. Darling's mocking mouth always had one kiss on it that Wendy could never get, though it was there, perfectly conspicuous in the right-hand corner of her mouth. Even her husband got all of her, except the kiss. And if you ask me, that kiss was Mrs. Darling's own precious piece of Neverland that she found as a child and kept locked away from everyone. So this morning, to all our young people, I say this: enjoy your youth. In fact, I hope you're enjoying it so much that you're not even listening to me right now. And to our adults, I say, don't grieve your lost youth too much. you have gained so much more, far more than you may realize. But on especially hard days, I encourage you to take a moment and find that lost piece of Neverland tucked away in the corner of your mouth. Blessed be.